Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I need to tell you about something that's been happening behind the scenes in Washington that you deserve to know about. It involves missing evidence, deleted documents, and what appears to be a deliberate effort by people in power to hide the truth about President Donald Trump's connection to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I know this Epstein story has been going on for years, and I know it can be confusing with all the twists and turns. So I'm going to walk you through this step by step in plain English so you understand exactly what's happening and why it matters. Let's start with something very simple. When a law enforcement agency like the FBI interviews a witness about a crime, they're supposed to keep records of that interview. They're supposed to file those records in a case file where other investigators can see them, where prosecutors can use them if they bring charges, and, when required by law, where the public can see them. That's just basic good government. That's how the system is supposed to work. But this week, an investigative journalist named Roger Sollenberger discovered something troubling. He found evidence that the FBI interviewed a woman who accused Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her when she was a teenager. And most of the records of those interviews appear to have been removed from the public files. Let me explain what he found, because the details matter here. Back in the summer of 2019, a woman contacted the FBI. This was just after Jeffrey Epstein had been arrested on federal sex trafficking charges. The woman told the FBI that when she was between 13 and 15 years old, sometime in the early to mid-1980s, Jeffrey Epstein introduced her to Donald Trump, and she said that Trump sexually assaulted her. According to documents that were briefly available on the Justice Department's website, this woman's allegations were serious and specific. She said Trump forced her to perform a sexual act. She said that when she bit him during that act, Trump punched her in the head and kicked her out. Now, I want to be very clear about something. An allegation is not proof. Just because someone makes an accusation doesn't mean it's true. The FBI gets tips and allegations all the time, and many of them turn out to be false or impossible to verify. But here's what's important. The FBI apparently found this woman credible enough to interview her, not just once, but 4 separate times. Roger Sollenberger found a document that was briefly posted on the Justice Department's website showing that the FBI conducted 4 interviews with this woman. The first interview happened on July 24, 2019. The second was on August 7th, the third was on August 20th, and the fourth was on October 16th. When law enforcement interviews someone 4 times, that tells you something. It tells you they take that person seriously. It tells you they're trying to gather as much information as possible. It tells you they consider that person a credible witness. But here's the problem. When Roger Sollenberger went looking for the actual interview records, the FBI reports where agents wrote down what the woman said, he could only find 1 of them. The first interview from July 24, 2019 is in the public files, but the other 3, missing. And then, after Sollenberger reported that the document showing there were 4 interviews existed, that document itself disappeared from the Justice Department website. Now, you might be thinking, maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe those files got lost or misfiled. But here's why that explanation doesn't hold up. The document that showed there were 4 interviews, it was created for Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. You remember Ghislaine Maxwell. She was Jeffrey Epstein's associate who was convicted of helping him abuse young girls. She's now in prison serving a 20-year sentence. During Maxwell's trial, the government had to turn over certain documents to her lawyers. It's called discovery. It's how the legal system works. The prosecution has to share evidence with the defense. So the government gave Maxwell's lawyers a document listing all the interviews they'd conducted with this particular woman. It shows there were 4 interviews. But when the government released the Epstein files to the public, they only included 1 of those 4 interviews. That means Ghislaine Maxwell, a convicted criminal sitting in federal prison, has access to 3 interview reports that you, the American public, are not allowed to see, even though Congress passed a law specifically requiring all Epstein-related documents to be released. Think about that for a moment. A woman in prison for helping Jeffrey Epstein abuse girls has information about Donald Trump that the American people don't have access to. Roger Sollenberger, the journalist who discovered this, made a very important point. By withholding these 3 interviews from the public while giving them to Ghislaine Maxwell, the Justice Department has essentially given Maxwell potential blackmail material on the sitting President of the United States. Now, does that mean Maxwell is actually blackmailing Trump? We don't know. But it means she could. She has information that the public doesn't have. Information that, according to the law, should have been released. When Sollenberger first reported that the document showing 4 interviews existed was missing from the Justice Department website, something interesting happened. Within a few hours, that document suddenly reappeared on the website. That tells you something too. It tells you someone at the Justice Department is paying attention. It tells you they're monitoring what journalists are reporting, and it tells you they made a choice. First to remove that document, and then to put it back when they got caught. But the 3 missing interview reports, those are still missing. As of this broadcast, the American public still cannot see what that woman told the FBI in her 2nd, 3rd, and 4th interviews. Now, Attorney General Pam Bondi testified before Congress last week. She was asked directly about the Epstein files and whether there was any evidence of wrongdoing by Donald Trump. And she said, and I'm quoting her, "There is no evidence that Trump committed any crime." But how can she say that when 3 FBI interview reports are being withheld from public view? How can she claim there's no evidence when the public can't see all the evidence? This is why people are frustrated. This is why people feel like there's a cover-up happening. Now let me tell you about another controversy involving these files, because it connects to this same pattern of the Trump administration making claims that don't match the documents. Back in December, when the Justice Department released its first batch of Epstein files, there was a letter in those files. The letter was addressed to Larry Nassar. You might remember him. He was the doctor for the U.S. Olympic gymnastics team who sexually abused hundreds of young female athletes. He's now serving essentially a life sentence in federal prison. This letter appeared to be from Jeffrey Epstein to Larry Nassar. It was dated August 13, 2019, which was 3 days after Epstein died in his jail cell. The letter made references to our president and contained crude language about young girls. The letter was found in the mailroom at the jail where Epstein was being held. It had been returned to sender because the address for Nassar was wrong. When this letter became public, the Justice Department immediately went on social media and declared it was fake. They said the FBI had confirmed it was fake. They gave 3 reasons. First, they said the handwriting didn't match Epstein's. Second, they said the postmark was from Virginia, not New York, where Epstein was jailed. Third, they said the return address didn't include Epstein's inmate number, which is required for outgoing prison mail. Now let's think about those reasons for a moment, because I want you to understand why people are skeptical. The postmark being from Virginia, that's not suspicious at all. Most prison mail gets processed through regional postal facilities, and Northern Virginia happens to be one of the main hubs for federal prison mail. So a letter from a New York jail could easily have a Virginia postmark after it goes through the postal system. The return address not having an inmate number, again, not that suspicious. Prisoners make mistakes. Letters get sent without all the proper information all the time. So really, the key claim is about the handwriting. The Justice Department said the handwriting didn't match Epstein's. But here's the interesting part. Back in July 2020, more than 5 years ago, the FBI sent that letter to their laboratory for professional handwriting analysis. They wanted experts to compare the letter to known samples of Epstein's handwriting and determine whether Epstein wrote it or not. The FBI put out a formal request for this analysis. That request is in the public files. You can go read it yourself. But the actual results of that analysis, the FBI has never released them. Not in 2020, not in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, or 2025, and not now in 2026. So when the Justice Department claimed in December that the FBI has confirmed this letter is fake, they never showed us the actual FBI lab report that supposedly confirms that. Why not? If they have a lab report from expert handwriting analysts saying definitively that Epstein didn't write that letter, why not release it? Why not show the American people the proof? Now, some journalists have been digging into this, and what they found is interesting. According to one report, the actual FBI lab analysis from 2020 concluded that they couldn't determine whether Epstein wrote the letter or not. The reason? They claimed they didn't have enough verified samples of Epstein's handwriting to make a comparison. Think about that. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy businessman who kept detailed records. He wrote emails, letters, notes. He signed documents. There should be plenty of samples of his handwriting available. So why would the FBI lab say they didn't have enough samples to make a comparison? I don't know the answer to that. But it raises questions, and it fits a pattern we keep seeing. The Trump administration making claims about what the evidence shows, but not actually showing us the evidence. Now, while all this is going on, while journalists are discovering missing FBI interviews and questioning claims about fake letters, you know what the two people in charge of investigating the Epstein files are doing? They're hosting a podcast together. I'm not making this up. FBI Director Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who used to be the Deputy FBI Director and is now a right-wing radio host, co-hosted a podcast episode this week. Now, that might not sound strange to younger people who are used to everyone having podcasts, but I want the folks over 60 watching this to understand how weird this is. The director of the FBI, the person in charge of the most important federal law enforcement agency in the country, is co-hosting a podcast with a media personality during work hours while he's supposed to be investigating serious crimes. Can you imagine J. Edgar Hoover hosting a podcast? Can you imagine any previous FBI director doing this? And here's what makes it even more strange. For years, before Kash Patel became FBI director and before Dan Bongino quit the FBI to become a podcaster, these two men built their entire public brands on talking about Jeffrey Epstein. They went on television, they wrote on social media, they gave speeches, and their message was always the same. Why isn't anyone investigating the Epstein files? Why is the FBI covering this up? Release the files, hold people accountable. Kash Patel and Dan Bongino made their careers demanding transparency about Epstein. But now that Kash Patel is actually in charge of the FBI, now that he has the power to release every single document and pursue every single lead, what's he doing? He's hosting a podcast where he complains about how hard his job is. In the episode this week, Kash Patel and Dan Bongino spent the time talking about how difficult it is to make decisions. They said they have to make level 10 decisions every day, and that President Trump has to make level 11 decisions. They talked about how much criticism they face. They talked about how the media is unfair to them. But you know what they didn't talk about? The Epstein files. They didn't talk about the missing FBI interviews. They didn't talk about why only 1 out of 4 interviews was released. They didn't talk about why the handwriting analysis from 2020 was never made public. Instead, they changed the subject. They started talking about how they defeated something called Antifa. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, Antifa is short for anti-fascist. It's not really an organization. It's more of a loose movement of people who protest against far-right groups. There's no membership, no headquarters, no leader. But Kash Patel and Dan Bongino spent time on their podcast bragging about how they destroyed Antifa. They said they made 24 federal arrests. They talked about convicting 19 people for acts of violence related to Antifa. The problem is, most Americans aren't worried about Antifa. Most Americans want to know whether powerful people sexually abused children and got away with it. But Kash Patel and Dan Bongino don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about defeating an enemy that most people don't even believe is a real organized threat. It's a distraction, and it seems pretty deliberate. Meanwhile, some interesting things are happening outside the mainstream political world. There are right-wing podcasters and commentators, people who supported Donald Trump, people who voted for him in 2024, who are now speaking out about the Epstein files. Dave Smith is one example. He's a libertarian podcaster who publicly said he was voting for Trump in 2024. He explained his reasons on his show. He thought Trump was better than the alternative. But this week, Dave Smith said something remarkable on his podcast. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Nothing could vindicate Donald Trump here. Even if all the files were released and there's no evidence Trump did anything with young girls, he still tried to cover it all up, so it doesn't matter. He's not vindicated." Think about that. A Trump voter saying that Trump is not vindicated by the Epstein files. Dave Smith went on to say, Trump did a complete 180. He went from promising to release everything to saying there's no such thing as the Epstein files, that it's a Democratic hoax. How can anyone still defend Donald Trump? Another right-wing podcaster who goes by the name Cigar and Jetty said this week, there's a check in the files showing Trump's ex-girlfriend being sold from Epstein to Trump. This is a bad look. And the fact that the FBI actually interviewed a victim who was accusing Trump, that goes beyond an anonymous claim on a tip line. These are people who are part of Trump's political base. These are not Democrats. These are not liberals. These are people who, until very recently, supported Donald Trump. And they're looking at the Epstein files and saying, this doesn't look good. This looks like a cover-up. So what's the bottom line? What should you take away from all of this? Here's what we know for certain. 1. The FBI interviewed a woman who accused Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her when she was a teenager. They interviewed her 4 times. Only one of those 4 interview reports has been released to the public, even though the law requires all Epstein-related documents to be released. 2. Ghislaine Maxwell, the convicted criminal who helped Jeffrey Epstein abuse young girls, has access to those 3 unreleased interview reports. That means she has information about the president that the American public doesn't have. 3. The Justice Department under Trump has been removing documents from public view and then restoring them after journalists report on the removals. That suggests they're being selective about what they want you to see. 4. When the Justice Department claims that evidence proves something, like that a letter is fake, they're not showing us the actual evidence that supposedly proves their claim. They just expect us to trust them. 5. The people in charge of investigating the Epstein files, people who built their careers demanding transparency, are now in power and refusing to provide that transparency. And 6, even some of Trump's own supporters are starting to question whether there's a cover-up happening. Now, does any of this prove that Donald Trump committed a crime? No. I want to be clear about that. These documents and missing interviews don't prove guilt. They raise questions. They suggest there's more to the story than we're being told. But here's what I believe, and I think most fair-minded people would agree. If you're innocent, you should welcome transparency. If you have nothing to hide, you should want all the evidence released so everyone can see for themselves. Donald Trump could make this controversy go away tomorrow. He could order the Justice Department to release everything. All 4 FBI interview reports, the 2020 handwriting analysis of the Nassar letter, the 3 million pages of documents that haven't been released yet. All of it. If he did that, and if the evidence showed he wasn't involved in any wrongdoing, this story would be over. People would see the evidence and make their own judgments. But instead, Trump's administration is fighting transparency. They're withholding documents. They're making claims without showing proof. They're removing things from public view and hoping no one notices. That's not what innocent people do. For those of you watching who are my age or older, you remember Watergate. You remember how that scandal unfolded. It started with a burglary that seemed like a minor crime. But then came the cover-up, the deleted tapes, the missing minutes, the claims of executive privilege. And what did we learn from Watergate? We learned that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. We learned that when powerful people try to hide the truth, it usually means there's something worth hiding. I'm not saying this is exactly like Watergate, but the pattern is similar. The instinct to hide rather than reveal, the selective release of information, the attacks on journalists who uncover inconvenient facts. It's troubling, and it should trouble you too, regardless of your politics. Because this isn't about whether you like Donald Trump or hate him. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat. This is about whether we live in a country where powerful people can bury evidence of potential crimes, or whether we live in a country where the law applies equally to everyone. Jeffrey Epstein abused over 1,000 young girls and women over several decades. He did it with help from powerful people who enabled him, who looked the other way, who participated in his crimes. Only 2 people have faced consequences: Epstein himself, who died in jail, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who's in prison. Everyone else, walking free, living their lives, some of them still in positions of power and influence. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was supposed to change that. Congress passed a law requiring everything to be released so the American people could see the truth. But the Trump administration is not following that law. They're slow-walking the releases. They're withholding documents. They're making claims without evidence. And the people in charge, people like Kash Patel, who spent years demanding transparency, are now hosting podcasts and complaining about how hard their jobs are instead of doing what they promised, releasing the files and holding people accountable. You deserve better. The survivors of Epstein's abuse deserve better, and the American system of justice deserves better. So pay attention to this story. Don't let it fade from the news cycle. Ask your elected representatives what they're doing to demand full transparency. Support journalists like Roger Sollenberger who are doing the hard work of uncovering what's being hidden. Because in the end, this is about whether we're going to have a government that serves the people or a government that serves the powerful. And that choice, that fight, is one every generation has to take on. Thank you for watching.